I've been asked to come out here and entertain you.
With his lantern jaw, his towering height, and his booming voice,
Grandpa, forget it!
he will be forever known as the Munster with the heart of a child. But off-screen, Fred Gwynne endured personal tragedy and professional setbacks to emerge as an accomplished artist, a respected author, and one of the finest character actors of his generation.
We learn as we go.
His face was very stoic, yet there was a lot of emotion in what was going on behind it.
I'd like to speak to you in my chambers.
Fred was not the Hollywood Anglo-Saxon handsome, so acting was a way of, see, I'm as good as.
They love me out there. I got them right in the palm of my hand.
As a TV dad, he was the best you could ask for.
I'm doing this for Eddie.
It was like this very small, shy person in this huge presence of a man.
My father was very, very funny, a talented artist, a generous man with a very, very loud voice.
That's what I heard!
Fred Gwynne was just a great big teddy bear.
New York City in the 1920s. The Great War was over. The economy was thriving. And the blue bloods of Manhattan's cafe society were kicking up their heels at speakeasies around the town. It was in this atmosphere of parties and privilege that Frederick Hubbard Gwynne was born on July 10, 1926. His father, Frederick, was a successful stockbroker whose gregarious and whimsical personality delighted his young son. Fred's mother, Dorothy, was a strong-willed and artistic woman who had created the popular comic strip Sonny Jim. But once her son was born, Fred became the center of her universe.
She had tried to have children before him, and I think 2 or 3 had died. So he was sort of a miracle baby for her, and she, just showered him with praise and love and attention.
Doted on by his mother, Fred enjoyed all the benefits that wealth allowed as he came of age surrounded by America's aristocracy.
I remember Fred telling me that in the wintertime, his dad used to have a house down in Palm Beach in Florida, right next to Joe Kennedy's house. So they moved in those kinds of circles.
But in 1935, the 8-year-old's idyllic existence ended when his father unexpectedly died after a routine sinus operation. Shattered by the loss of the man he adored, the lonely youngster often withdrew into an imaginary world he created in his sketches, a talent he shared with his mother.
He was always drawing, and I'm sure that his mother loved it since she was a cartoonist herself, and so she would encourage him to do that. You couldn't keep a pen out of his hands.
Fred's mother also nurtured him through his awkward years at school, when a sudden growth spurt set the adolescent apart from his peers.
Can you imagine a kid who was that tall and gangly, and you'd think he would be ostracized more than embraced? And I think his mother just made him feel so comfortable with himself that he was just very well liked.
In 1939, 13-year-old Fred entered Groton, an elite and highly competitive East Coast prep school. Fred became an outgoing and popular student. He sang in the school choir, and he excelled in his art classes, studying under the noted portrait artist R.S. Merriman. As the young student's passion for art grew, he studied everything from the Impressionist to the 19th century political cartoons of Honoré Daumier. He also joined the drama program, which allowed him to express his whimsical personality. But throughout Gwynne's high school years, a dark cloud hung over the young men at Groton. In 1941, America entered the Second World War, and patriotic teens everywhere were eager to fight for their country. When Fred graduated in 1944, he immediately enlisted in the United States Navy. For 2 years, the 6'5" seaman served aboard a subchaser in the Pacific as a radio operator.
You almost went insane. The Morse code constantly in your ear, going on, keeping up. He wept before the captain. He said, because he wanted to get out of it. He'd do anything, so he wept. And somebody said, "Aren't you ashamed of yourself?" But he got out of radio duty.
After 2 years at sea, Gwynne was ready for an intellectual challenge, which he found at Harvard University. It was here that the undergraduate discovered an outlet for his artistic talent and wicked wit on the staff of the Harvard Lampoon, joining forces with fellow classmates John Updike and George Plimpton. By 1950, Fred's gift for satire had catapulted him to the presidency of the notorious humor magazine. Gwynne also lent his towering presence to the university's Hasty Pudding Society, where his outrageous antics became legendary around campus.
The Hasty Pudding is a theater group where there are no women, so the men dress as women, and you can imagine, he just had a ball. Loved to make people laugh.
Gwynne basked in the attention he received from an audience, and the campus clown was anxious to test his skills outside the Ivy League. Fred began performing at the nearby Brattle Theater Company, where he quickly became enchanted with the colorful and eccentric world of the stage. Romance also cast a spell over the Harvard student when he met 22-year-old Foxy Renard at a friend's wedding.
And I think for my father it was love at first sight. My mother was very beautiful, and I'm not sure it went the other way.
But Fred was captivated by the free-spirited young woman and pursued her ardently.
Well, we liked each other. He was shy, he was very funny. I mean, I appreciate humor a lot.
After a year-long courtship, the couple tied the knot in a small ceremony on June 30th, 1952. The newlyweds became popular hosts to a large circle of friends who were charmed by Fred's acerbic sense of humor.
He was an introvert, but he might trick people into thinking he was an extrovert. He would be on for a lot of people. You know, he'd play a role and they'd think that they were very popular with him, haha, till they'd leave and he'd say, "Oh, Christ, what bores."
After a successful run as Bottom in the Brattle Theater production of A Midsummer Night's Dream, the 25-year-old performer felt emboldened enough to try his luck in the Big Apple. New York in the early 1950s was the artistic hub of the country. The new medium of television was thriving, and Broadway was producing some of its biggest hits. Fred and Foxy moved into a modest apartment, and Fred hit the pavement looking for work. But initially, he met some resistance.
People said he was too tall or too thin or, you know, had a lantern jaw or something. But then, obviously, other people saw that he had talent. People were just swept up by that.
The novice actor quickly landed his first Broadway show with a supporting role in Mrs. McThing, starring the illustrious Helen Hayes. The following year, Fred was overjoyed at the birth of his first son, Kieran. But the new father's elation quickly turned to heartache when Kieran suffered a severe brain injury that left him mentally disabled.
He had a subdural hematoma when he was about 1.5 years and had brain surgery, which in those days the scar went from ear to ear. And from the surgery he developed epilepsy and had grand mal seizures, which was very hard. My father needed to have a perfect son. So I think it was hard, as it is for any parents, to have a child that isn't exactly perfect. And that it was the first child was harder still.
To escape his anguish, Gwynne threw himself into his work. In 1954, Fred made the acquaintance of director Elia Kazan, who gave him a bit part as one of Lee J. Cobb's henchmen in On the Waterfront. That same year, Foxy gave birth to a daughter, Gaynor. Although he had little interest in the day-to-day tasks of fatherhood, Fred grew to be a delightful companion for his children.
They all adored him. They all thought he was very funny, you know, and great fun, but he didn't do much. And he'd go off in the studio and spend hours there painting or learning the guitar or something, and so he wasn't really involved.
But Gwynne took his responsibilities as a breadwinner seriously. With the cost of Kieran's special needs escalating, Fred accepted a job as a copywriter at the J. Walter Thompson Advertising Agency. For the next 5 years, he juggled his ad job with a variety of stage and television appearances, including roles in such prestigious live shows as Studio One and Kraft Television Theater.
He had a wonderful boss who said, you know, if you have a job, I'll fix it so you can take the time off and do it. So that was fairly unheard of. So he worked quite a lot.
In 1958, Gwynne's active imagination drove him to create Best in Show, a fanciful book featuring his portraits of pets and their look-alike owners. 2 years later, he published What's Nude, a volume of racy cartoons for adults. Though he was content at his easel, in 1960, an offer to appear on Broadway in the musical Irma la Douce lured Gwynne back to the stage.
He never looked for a job, which sounds pretty strange, but they'd always come to him. He'd say, he said, well, I'm not going to be bothered. Theater, I'm going to draw. And then the phone would ring.
In 1961, Fred received a call from innovative television producer Nat Hiken, who had cast Gwynne several years earlier in a guest spot on his series Sergeant Bilko. This time he offered the actor a starring role as a New York City cop opposite another Sergeant Bilko alum, Joey Ross, in a primetime NBC sitcom.
There's a holdup in the Bronx, Brooklyn's broken out in fights. There's a traffic jam in Harlem that's backed up to Jackson Heights. There's a scout troop short a child, cruise ships do, and I go wild. Car 54, where are you?
Filmed in the Bronx, Car 54, Where Are You? Followed the misadventures of a pair of bumbling patrolmen assigned to the wackiest beat in the city.
Joey was a comedian who worked nightclubs and strip joints. And so he had the comedian's delivery. Joey would just blurt out the line. Fred would listen and react, and his timing was impeccable.
Francis, why are you so afraid of girls?
Gunther, it's not that I'm afraid of girls. It's just that, well...
What?
Look at me. I'm 6'6", and 5'6" of me is face. You know what they call me in grammar school? Horse face.
Don't pay no attention to kids. They just repeat what other people say.
Fred relished the opportunity to work alongside actors whose ethnic and cultural diversity was groundbreaking in network television. Among the talented cast were Hank Garrett, Al Lewis, and Nipsey Russell.
Most comedies were pretty, white bread back in the early 60s, and you wouldn't get a lot of racial blending, but it was probably more progressive at the time than we would think it is by looking at it now.
Off-screen, Fred and co-star Al Lewis formed a close friendship.
I got to know Fred, from working the show, 5 days a week. Became very friendly with Fred. He was very open, very warm, a good guy. Really, really good guy.
The show became an immediate hit, and 35-year-old Fred Gwynne became a household name. And when he and Foxy celebrated the birth of their third child, a son, Dylan, the rising star was happier than ever. But on July 12, 1963, while on the set of Car 54, the actor received the devastating news that his infant son, Dylan, had drowned in the pool of the family's new house in Bedford. Fred was inconsolable. The pain of losing a child put an overwhelming strain on Fred and Foxy's relationship, and the couple separated.
I would say that was horribly traumatic for my parents, but maybe even more so for my father, since that was the perfect boy. He finally had one that was perfect, and I'm sure it was just devastating.
With his family life falling apart, Fred returned to the set, where he hid his private turmoil under a stoic demeanor.
He kept a lot of stuff to himself. When he experienced a tragedy with the loss of his child, he didn't come out and say, my child just died. He really didn't want to get into it. He was able to push that aside, do the job. Once the job was finished, then he became Fred Gwynne, the bereaved dad.
Numb with grief, Fred struggled to get through the months that followed. Burying himself in work, he juggled a Broadway show with his TV series until Car 54 was canceled after a 2-year run. But in 1964, a call from Hollywood would change Gwynne's life forever.
This is, where you live?
Yep, this is it. Come on in and have a cup of coffee. I want you to meet my aunt and uncle.
Within months of Car 54's cancellation, Fred Gwynne was offered the lead in a proposed television show based on the classic movie monsters Frankenstein, Dracula, and the Wolfman. The comedy would center on an eerie family of monsters living in the middle of a typical suburban neighborhood.
Hi, Uncle Herman.
Hello, Marilyn.
I'd like you to meet my date. This is Jack. What's the matter with me, anyway?
Teamed with friend and Car 54 co-star Al Lewis, Fred appeared as Herman Munster in this rarely seen test, opposite Joan Marshall as his vampire wife, Happy Durman in the role of their son Eddie, and Beverly Owen as the Munsters' niece, whose all-American beauty made her the family misfit.
It's the family living in a neighborhood where they don't quite fit in, but they don't quite realize that. But they also don't see that Marilyn looks like the rest of the world.
After extensive retooling, which included shooting the series in cost-effective black and white, as well as recasting the role of Herman's son Eddie with 11-year-old Butch Patrick, and the role of Herman's wife with 50s screen siren Yvonne DiCarlo.
See? Mommy sewed the ear back on your woof woof.
Fred reluctantly agreed to sign on.
He didn't want to do it, but the money was too good. And he thought, well, he'd try it. The whole idea kind of turned him off.
With the show now in production, Fred and Foxy reconciled in the hope that they could make a new life for themselves and their children in Los Angeles. And on September 24th, 1964, The Munsters premiered on CBS.
In this one year of 1964, you had The Munsters come on the air. That same month, The Addams Family came on the air. That same month, Bewitched came on the air. There seems to be just this weird little cultural explosion at the moment about spoofing sitcoms through the conventions of fantasy and through horror.
The Munsters was an immediate hit, but it was Fred's interpretation of the Frankenstein monster as an innocent, childlike character that captured the audience's hearts. The inventive actor used many tools to bring his character to life. He created a unique voice by adapting his mother's lyrical vocal tones.
Patience, Peter Pan. You may not believe this, but I'm Secret Agent 702.
Well now, how about that?
And when he added the hearty guffaw of a prop man to his portrayal, Herman's laugh became his trademark.
He really immersed himself in that role, and that's one of the things that most people aren't aware of when they see the Herman Munster character, of how good a job and how good an actor he really was to pull that off.
I put Lily in the cabinet. I pull the curtain. I said a few magic words. And I push the button. And then I opened the curtains, and she was gone. Grandpa, you've got to help me.
Lily, you come back.
Hi, Mom. I'm glad you're back. Papa's really cracking up.
Another high point of the show was the special comedic rapport that Fred and Al Lewis shared on screen.
They worked well with each other, and they really were up there, as far as comedic teams with, Laurel and Hardy, Abbott and Costello, you name them.
Grandpa, did you hear door slam?
Yes, I did hear a door slam.
Was it the back door?
No, it wasn't the back door.
Was it the side door?
No, it wasn't the side door.
What kind of door was it?
It was the only door. We never for a second ever cheated the audience. We wanted to be, both of us, better than we were, and I think we succeeded.
The Munsters quickly developed into a national phenomenon and became one of the first series to be mass merchandised.
I think that it was aiming very heavily at the kid market because they merchandised the show almost immediately. They had all kinds of Munster's toys and gizmos, and there was the Munster mobile that you could see at the parades and stuff.
The actors also did their part in promoting the show with numerous personal appearances, as well as television commercials.
This is my father. He hangs pictures, helps Grandpa experiment, helps Mommy with the cleaning. Where does he get his go? From me. I lend him my Cheerios.
Big G, little O. Go with Cheerios.
By 1964, Fred had become one of television's most famous faces, but the stifling makeup and heavy costume were taking their toll on the 38-year-old star.
You know, we had to be there 6 o'clock, 2-hour makeup and the hair, and Fred the headpiece and the boats and the foam. Terrible. He suffered terribly, Fred, under the foam. Unbelievable. Didn't breathe. When we would have to go to lunch, he'd get into slippers and he'd take off the boot. And he'd pour out sweat from the boot, I would say a half a gallon.
Forced to take salt tablets to prevent severe dehydration, Fred also began suffering chronic back pain and grew dangerously thin.
He would put this air hose down inside the suit and blow cold air down there, drink gallons and gallons and gallons of lemonade to keep from being dehydrated, but he still got thinner and thinner and thinner. He really lost a lot of weight doing the show.
Making the Munsters even more difficult for Fred was his growing frustration with the show's scripts.
After a while, there's only so many times you can go to the well of these type of jokes that we'd already done twice. And Fred was very frustrated because he was a professional, a consummate professional, and you know, it got to the point where he felt that he'd done everything he possibly could and there was really nowhere else for him to go.
Now running the risk of becoming repetitive, the series took a 1-2 punch in its second season when ABC's Batman premiered opposite the creepy comedy. In a desperate ploy for increased viewership, the studio decided to produce a color feature film adaptation entitled Munster, Go Home.
Don't I look frightfully handsome in Technicolor? Call the police. Right. Get the FBI. Will do. Call Scotland Yard. Right now. Phone Batman. I got it. Car 54, where are you?
See Herman Munster in his Dracula challenge some of the world's fastest cars in history's weirdest race.
But nothing could help the Munsters. By the end of the year, the spooky series had lost the ratings race, and CBS canceled the show.
He was happy. He was at the cast party. He held up a little sign that said, "Everybody says, watch Batman." You know, he had no problems. He was ready to go. He wanted to go, and it was time, and he was very, very happy to return home.
After 2 years of playing Herman Munster, the actor was ready for a break from the grueling role. But for Fred Gwynne, escaping the part that had made him famous would prove to be more difficult than he could ever have imagined. By the fall of 1966, the Munsters had vanished from network television, and after a brief respite, a restless Fred Gwynne was ready to return to work. But the actor was shocked by the devastating effect his 2 years as Herman Munster had on his acting career.
It wasn't until he was out of the Munsters that he realized that it had hurt him a lot as far as acting. His name would come up for a part, and they'd say, "Oh, come on, Herman Munster for that? Are you crazy?"
Dispirited, in 1967, the 41-year-old star left Hollywood and moved back to New York.
He didn't like Hollywood. I guess a little bit too fakey and glitzy for him, and he didn't want to put up with that. I mean, that's what you have to put up with if you're going to be, quote unquote, a Hollywood celebrity star. You have to be able to pretend and look as though you're not pretending. And Fred couldn't do that.
He wanted to retire more and more from life, from doing anything, from appearing in public, from giving autographs.
Fred was now free to spend more time at home with his family, which had grown to include another daughter, Madden, and a son, Evan. But even the arrival of 2 more children could not mask the fact that Fred and Foxy's relationship was on rocky ground.
Their marriage was not happy, and there was a lot of fighting, a lot of disagreeing. You know, like every good Irishman, my father did like his cocktails, and that only led to louder voices and more disagreements. The animosity grew exponentially.
As life at home was becoming unbearable, Fred found refuge in the relative security of the sound stages, taking whatever roles were offered in an effort to change the public's perception of him. In 1969, he accepted a part in NBC's made-for-TV musical The Littlest Angel, co-starring Johnny Whitaker. That same year, the distinctive actor was seen as the grotesque villain in the television version of Arsenic and Old Lace. Then in 1970, NBC hired Gwynne to star in an upcoming series titled Anderson and Company. Fred played a turn-of-the-century store owner and the father of 8 rambunctious children.
Let's get one thing clear. This is a place of business, not a kindergarten.
Oh, you're raising your voice.
Never, under any circumstances, are the children to come in this store again without express permission from me. Never, never, never.
All right. We'll take our patronage elsewhere.
Good. Any store but mine.
Come along, children.
But when the period comedy failed to catch on, the network passed on the series. The Harvard intellectual was forced to concede that his acting career had not lived up to his expectations and turned to the one creative outlet over which he had sole control. Though he was no longer receiving a regular salary, wise investments allowed Gwynne the freedom to indulge in his passion for art.
He had a studio at the house that my parents had that was separate from the house, and he just painted and painted and painted.
Inspired by his daughter, Madden, Fred began working on a children's book that combined his fanciful sense of humor with his love of wordplay.
I had asked him one day about the mole on his face, and he said, "That's a mole," and he said, "I examined it." And a few days later, the cat killed this little furry brown animal on the lawn, and I said, "What is that?" And he said, "That's a mole." And he said, "I stared from this brown animal to his face, back and forth and back and forth," and he said finally he realized what I was doing, and it just cracked him up.
This misunderstanding led to a series of children's books which, over the years, included such classics as The King Who Reigned, A Chocolate Mousse for Dinner, and A Little Pigeon Toad. While the books were hugely successful, Gwynne still felt he had to prove himself as a serious actor and decided to return to the small stages of New England, where his career had begun 23 years earlier. But more than a few heads turned when the former television star was cast as Big Daddy in a revival of Tennessee Williams' Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, co-starring Elizabeth Ashley.
There was great trepidation, and all during the rehearsal period, I can remember people saying to me, I mean, right, you got Herman Munster playing Big Daddy? I mean, come on, he's done everything. But nobody remembers that he's ever done anything but this, and he wants to come and do it.
Unfazed by the skeptics, Gwynne turned in a stellar performance that won him praise from the play's legendary author.
Fred brought every aspect to it that Tennessee had ever conceived of. And that's very rare when you're dealing with a playwright like Tennessee Williams.
Realizing that theater offered him the quality of work to which he had always aspired, Fred continued to act in a variety of acclaimed stage productions, including a role as Claudius in Shakespeare's Hamlet, and that of the stage manager in Thornton Wilder's Our Town.
I think that it took so much out of him to go on stage, but he did love the theater. He really did, and I think that was really his element. I mean, I've seen him on stage, and he just glows.
In 1979, the versatile actor won an Obie Award for his performance in the off-Broadway play Grand Magic. At 53, Fred had established himself as one of the theater's principal character actors. His years as a film and television star seemed far behind him, but it was a situation that wouldn't last for long. In 1979, 53-year-old Fred Gwynne was approached by Italian filmmaker Bernardo Bertolucci. The director of such landmark films as The Conformist and The Last Tango in Paris offered Gwynne a pivotal role in the somber drama Luna, starring Jill Clayburgh.
I had a strange dream last night.
What?
Oh, it's boring.
Tell me.
No, you're busy packing. I'll tell you later.
Tell me your dreams.
When people tell me their dreams, I find it very uninteresting. I'll tell you later. We'll have loads of time on the boat, okay? Remember, we have 2 hours to get ready.
By now, Gwynne was beginning to prove that there was more to him than Herman Munster. But at home, Fred's relationship to Foxy was unraveling, and after 28 years together, the couple decided to divorce.
You just drift apart. It happens. You suddenly, nothing looks very colorful or fun, and there were a lot of battles and a lot of unpleasantness. So we split.
In 1980, Fred moved into an apartment on Manhattan's Upper West Side. Gwynne enjoyed the bachelor life, but all that changed when a friend introduced him to 30-year-old Deborah Flater.
We had a lot in common. I was working in book publishing. He, at the time, was working on one of his children's books. And I took an interest in what he was doing, and so we had a common ground there.
Deb's strong will and take-charge attitude appealed to Fred, and they soon began seeing more of each other.
She made him feel very secure, and she's a strong woman, and he really liked that. He likes to have a strong woman to take care of him, and he liked to be told which way to go. And Debbie was just the woman for the job.
Together, the couple decided to focus their energy on Fred's film and TV career. In 1981, the 55-year-old actor received an offer to reprise the role of Herman Munster in the NBC TV movie The Munster's Revenge.
Fred did not want to really do the Munster thing again. And I told him, I said, look, the thing to do is name an astronomical figure. And they'll reject it, and that'll be the end of it. Well, he named an astronomical figure. Well, they took it.
After filming was completed, Fred was eager to move on to more serious acting challenges. In 1984, Gwynne got his chance when he won a flashy role in Francis Ford Coppola's The Cotton Club, starring Richard Gere and Bob Hoskins. Fred was cast as Big Frenchie, the loyal friend and bodyguard to Hoskins' club owner, Oni Madden.
Bob Hoskins and Fred wrote some of their own scenes, in particular the watch scene. I think it added a new perspective to Fred's acting ability.
Let me see your watch. Let's see. They picked me up in front of the club about... sorry. They picked me up about... Oh, shit. I think I broke it.
Come here, give it to me.
No. I could fix it. Here.
You cheap son of a bitch! You only offered $500 for me? What? If you were kidnapped, I wouldn't offer more than that for you.
For his performance, Gwynne received the attention of other influential Hollywood directors. And over the next few years, the actor entered a new phase in his career when he appeared in a series of A-list films that established him as one of Hollywood's most sought-after character actors. His personal life mirrored his newfound stability, and on March 9, 1988, he and Deb married. The following year, Gwynne decided it was time to publicly display his artwork. The exhibit, which he called Drawn and Quartered, featured paintings that combined Fred's lifelong love of wordplay with his irreverent sense of humor.
He was a spiritual person. He was very interested in the hereafter and who God was and what power that makes us all tick. And he expressed a lot of that in his paintings.
Opening night, I mean, it was, a zoo. People standing outside. everyone was, really excited about it.
At an age when most people are retiring, Fred Gwynne was at his creative prime. He continued to turn in standout performances in such films as Stephen King's Pet Sematary and the heist comedy Disorganized Crime, starring Lou Diamond Phillips, Reuben Blades, and Daniel Roebuck.
We need another 900.
Why don't we just take out a loan?
We can hit one more.
Are you out of your mind? We're gonna get nailed.
This isn't Miami, you know. Every cop they have will be swarming over that market. If we hit another right now, they won't be ready.
They won't be ready? I'm not ready. I haven't done this since I was 17.
Go.
I can't believe I'm doing this.
The film was shot in Montana, and Gwynne, who had developed a fear of flying, traveled to the location in a custom motorhome with Deb. Still newlyweds, the couple's playful chemistry lit up the set.
Fred and Debbie seemed really like they saw life the same way. They played the same way, they talked the same way, and they just seemed perfect together.
The movie received only modest attention, but critics singled out Fred's subtle performance as a highlight. Although the 63-year-old actor was now working steadily, Fred grew irritable and restless.
He was very emotional. There were times when you would almost feel he was manic depressive because it would be that extreme. But it was more, he would become frustrated with himself if he wasn't working. It would bug him. And he would drive you crazy about not working. But then when he was working, he'd drive you crazy about working.
After years of personal and professional highs and lows, the lanky star was ready to put his career on the back burner and seek out a more tranquil way of life. But now that Fred was anxious to retire, he found himself in greater demand than ever before. In 1989, after living most of his life in New York, Fred Gwynne decided to leave behind the hustle and bustle of the big city.
We both realized that we really missed the country. We thought, boy, wouldn't it be nice to have a place in the country?
The couple purchased a farm in rural Maryland, where Deb had grown up.
Well, at that time it was 280 acres, and we added 10 more to it. But the house was unlivable. Most people would have bulldozed the house, but we felt it had character, it was old, it had history, and it was fun to do.
While Deb struggled to turn the ranch into a profitable venture, Fred focused on his art.
They had to build him a big studio. He had this big, beautiful, spacious studio, and he got so much work done. But I have a feeling that he missed the city sometimes and missed just the pulse, the beat of city living and sort of the excitement of it all.
To help finance the costly renovations, the actor turned to the lucrative world of commercial voiceovers, and his rich bass baritone could be heard in a variety of TV ads, such as this one for Dreyer's Ice Cream.
Doing things the old-fashioned way does take a little extra time, but it's worth it. Because it keeps the greedy little rugrats away from her Dreyer's almond praline.
He had found voiceovers and found that, man, that was an easy way to make money. And then he could paint and draw and write children's books and do all those other great things.
Though Fred had all but given up his film career, in 1991, he accepted a key role in the courtroom comedy My Cousin Vinny, starring Joe Pesci, Marissa Tomei, and Ralph Macchio. In the film, Pesci portrayed an inexperienced New York attorney defending his cousin before a stern Southern judge, played by Gwynne.
Counselor, your clients are charged with first-degree murder. How'd they plead?
Ayana, my client...
Don't talk to me sitting in that chair.
He told me to sit here.
Because he's not very legalistic. I tell him up front that procedure is what I'm all about. When you're addressing this court, you will rise and speak to me in a clear, intelligible voice.
Sorry. My client's on...
What are you wearing?
Huh?
What are you wearing?
I'm wearing clothes.
With him and Joe Pesci, first, the physical disparity is hilarious anyway. And their performances together, they really had it was a terrific chemistry.
Is it possible the two youths...
To what? What was that word?
What word?
To what?
What?
Did you say utes?
Yeah, two youths.
What is a ute?
Oh, excuse me, Your Honor. Two youths.
My Cousin Vinny was a huge box office success, and Gwynne received some of the best reviews of his career. At the age of 66, the actor was now more in demand than ever. But in 1993, Fred began to experience severe back pain. A routine trip to the doctor delivered a devastating prognosis. He was in the advanced stages of pancreatic cancer. Given just 6 months to live, Fred now had to face his own mortality. To keep his spirits up, the multi-talented artist spent much of his time in the studio, painting and doodling. In his final months, Gwynne took time to say goodbye to his closest friends and family.
When it was pretty clear that he was going to die, we talked a lot about death, and he said he was going to see his mother and finally get to spend time with his father, which was something to look forward to. He always said that he felt that life was, that fast. And when we had to say goodbye and, when he was really, really ill, he just said, "I'll see you this soon."
On July 2nd, 1993, Fred Gwynne died in his sleep just 8 days before his 67th birthday. While Gwynne is gone, his memory lives on with the role he fought so hard to escape. With new fans discovering the Munsters in syndication, the series is more popular than ever.
His sound, his booming laugh was funny, his pop-eyed expressions. I mean, everything he had in his theatrical training went into just sending this character through the camera, really playing, I think, to the kids just who loved this guy.
Although Fred rarely discussed his role as Herman Munster, privately, he was proud of the character he had created.
Some days he was tired of being recognized as Herman Munster, and other days that was fine with him because Herman Munster was a nice guy.
But beyond the role that made him famous, Fred Gwynne leaves behind a rich legacy of work that included children's books, a collection of paintings and sculpture, and a diversity of screen roles that continue to touch audiences throughout the world.
I still get fan mail expressing how much he meant to them. And it kind of amazes me sometimes.
Fred Gwynne loved life, and he was given a lot of talents with which to express that love.
He was just this big, huge man, and he was a little boy inside of that big, huge man.
I never saw Fred's ego. He wasn't about, look at me. He was about the dance. He was fine.
Very hard to talk about someone you had so much fun with, you loved, you admired. I love you, Fred. Rest in peace.